Insider attacks in Afghanistan are forcing a major change in America's plan to withdraw from the war. The core of the exit strategy depends on training Afghan soldiers and police to take over security of their country. Now the U.S. military is scaling back those efforts because a rising numbers of Americans are being killed by the men they are training. Afghan government forces have turned their guns on NATO troops 36 times this year, killing 51, most of them American. That's more attacks than the last 2 years combined. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Colonel Jeff McCausland, CBS News Military Consultant. Jeff, good morning to you.
Terrell, good morning to you.
This has been an incredibly difficult undertaking from the start. Now this, NATO and Afghan forces not working together as much or as often in the field together. How big of a setback is this?
Well, this could be a significant setback, Terrell. You know, as you suggested, we've had innumerable attacks like this, 51 killed in action in the last year. It really undermines that strategy that, as you suggested at the onset, was to train, organize, and equip Afghan forces to take over their own security. It also calls into question the strategy post-2014, when the majority of our ground troops are supposed to be out of Afghanistan, but we'll still have a substantial number of forces there, primarily working directly with the Afghans, very closely training, advising, and equipping them. And if we can't solve this problem now, those soldiers would be at enormous risk.
You mentioned that 2014 deadline, and that's an important point to make here. It's been a big point of debate as well as contention, especially out there in Washington. When you look at that deadline now with this major setback, could we see that deadline maybe pushed or changed at this point?
I really doubt that, because I think politically we pretty much staked a claim that 2014 is where we're going to see the end of major combat operations. And oh, by the way, our NATO allies, I think, are certainly counting on that. And that came out of the NATO summit just this last May, when we were united in staying until 2014. And even this month, we see the surge force, that 33,000 additional soldiers that President Obama dispatched to Afghanistan about 2 years ago, the last of them coming home. So our forces now, at the end of this month, will drop down to about 68,000 in Afghanistan.
The U.S. military said that it would improve background checks for new Afghan recruits. It was one way to maybe curb these insider attacks. Is that going to help, and is there anything else that can be really done?
Well, we certainly hope so, and we really hope that the problem really is one of a Taliban strategy to infiltrate the military. Because if that's the case, then we really have a counterintelligence problem. So we've got to vet recruits better. We've got to use biometrics, to, of course, to identify those who have been picked up somewhere before. And I know we have now something like a million sets of biometric data on Afghans. We've got to depend on village elders to make better selections. But if this problem really is one of wider spread growing dissatisfaction in the Afghan population about the presence of U.S. and NATO forces in their country now entering the 12th year, that's a much more difficult nut to crack.
There's this question here about where this is coming from. Is it the Afghan population? Is it the Taliban? And if it's the Taliban, is their plan actually working?
And that's really difficult to say. The people I've talked with suggest that something less than half, maybe only 25% of the attacks are really motivated by some infiltration by the Taliban. And other motives have been suggested, everything from personal disagreements between individual soldiers and Afghans, perhaps more coming from the so-called Afghan local police that we've now been training, who are all localized in one village and therefore are the least reliable. And some have even suggested it may have been due to Ramadan over the last month or so, in which people were quite eating so much and were irritable. Whether or not any of those things are true, I don't think we really have a good grip right now. But you know, even the last day or so, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, said this problem is threatening the strategy. We've got to get to the bottom of it, and get to the bottom very quickly.
But Jeff, the Taliban is playing a significant role here. So if the Taliban had its way, what would be the grand plan, let's say 2-3 years down the line?
Well, to drive a greater wedge, first of all, between the United States and Afghan forces, undermine that effort to train, organize, and equip Afghan security forces, which would obviously give them some degree of a comparable advantage. Right now, we know that we had hoped that this surge strategy of getting to over 100,000 troops in Afghanistan over the last couple of years was going to result in improved battlefield momentum, which it appears it has, but also believe that this would also force the Taliban over time to come to the negotiating table, and we have not seen that occur.
So we fast forward now to 2014. Could we possibly see Afghanistan fall back into the hands or become a terrorist haven, especially when we're seeing setbacks like this?
Well, that always is a distinct possibility. At least we know, I think in 2014 at best, Afghanistan is going to be a country beset with still very significant security problems. We may see a lot more localized violence. There may be certain areas of the country that are relatively quiescent, but there in the south, where the large Pashtun population lives, and along the border with Pakistan, these are areas that are going to probably still have enormous security problems. The question then becomes, if the United States and NATO are removed from the equation, can those Afghan forces get sufficient training and reliability to take over that security burden?
Jeff McCausland, CBS News Military Consultant. Jeff, appreciate your insight. Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure, Terrell.